Well, numbers are slowing down slightly, so I will go ahead and kick us off so we can take advantage of the time that we have today. I want to thank you all for joining us. My name is Louise Bedsworth. I am Executive Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. We are a research center within the law school at UC Berkeley. As many of you are aware, CLEE serves to really link campus, the law school, and the broader campus to policymakers and stakeholders to help inform action and help us implement our most pressing climate and environmental address our most pressing climate and environmental challenges, and really with a focus on helping to implement our policies. We work with government, with business, and the nonprofit sector to help solve urgent problems that require creative and often interdisciplinary approaches. Through our Lunch and Learn series, we host conversations on a range of topics, highlighting new research, but also just providing space to tackle some of our complex policy challenges. Our Lunch and Learn series is made possible by our partners, Hanson Bridget, Oric, and Wilson Sonsini, and we thank them for their support. I'm very excited today that we have one of our research fellows, Shivani Shukla, who is going to moderate a conversation with two experts to talk about a really critical issue around reducing methane emissions. At CLEE, we are working on methane emissions reduction strategies and policies on a couple of fronts, working with partners across campus on how we address methane emissions from landfills and the waste sector, but then also through our work with the California-China Climate Institute, looking at ways that we can be partnering and collaborating to reduce methane emissions, and then also helping to support a subnational methane action commitment that was launched at COP earlier or late last year. And so we're really focused on how we can advance solutions, particularly at the subnational level, to help us reduce methane emissions. So we're very excited for today's conversation and to learn more about the work that is happening out on the ground. And I will turn it over to Shivani to guide that conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Louise. Hi all, thanks so much for tuning in today. I'm Shivani Shukla. I'm a climate policy research fellow here at CLEE. And I, along with my colleague Gil Damon, focus primarily on methane policy and implementation. So today we'll be having a conversation around recent methane regulations with Sarah and Xiaopu. As some of you may know, methane is a powerful but short-lived climate pollutant that has accounted for a third of net global warming to date. Rapidly reducing methane emissions from energy, agriculture, and waste is regarded as the single most effective strategy to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade while yielding co-benefits, including an additional use as an energy source, industry profits, and improving public health and agricultural productivity. Here, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today, Sarah Izant and Xiaopu Sun. Sarah Izant is the Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy at the California Environmental Protection Agency. Prior to joining CalEPA, Sarah served the city and county of San Francisco as Mayor London and Breed's Manager of State and Federal Affairs, Environmental Policy Advisor, and Deputy Press Director. She has worked in both state and federal governments as an advisor at the California Public Utilities Commission and Executive Fellow at the California Air Resources Board, and as a constituent services representative in the office of U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein. Welcome, Sarah. And Xiaopu Sun is a senior China counsel at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, IGSD. She has over a decade of experience conducting research and collaborative projects to advance the reduction of short-lived climate pollutants, including hydrofluorocarbons and methane, the topic of today's conversation, through international treaty platforms, as well as domestic regulations and policies with a regional focus on China. I'm happy to invite Sarah to start us off with her opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Shivani, for having me and for hosting this conversation. Hello, everyone. Thanks to you all for joining this exciting conversation. I'm really looking forward to getting to discuss this important topic of methane today. So my name is Sarah Izant. Shivani said I'm Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy at the California Environmental Protection Agency, or CalEPA. Just for those of you who may not be familiar, CalEPA is a regulatory agency that oversees 6 boards, departments, and offices within the state of California. And as part of my role, I work most closely with the California Air Resources Board, which is the primary regulatory agency in California for greenhouse gas emissions and for air quality matters. And I also coordinate with our other boards, departments, and offices on matters related to climate change. And as a key part of my work is to coordinate across agencies in California on international matters of climate cooperation, especially as California continues its leadership at the international level on climate action, really building out subnational leadership and partnerships with national governments to combat climate change collectively. So I think many of you here may know, but really the state of California, under the leadership of Gavin Newsom, is a leader on climate change and climate action. And the state is consistently leading the way on climate policies and regulations, including on methane, in our efforts to reach carbon neutrality by 2045. Given the urgency of climate change and the often disproportional impacts already being felt by underserved populations across California and the world, and the need to rapidly decarbonize and avoid climate tipping points as identified in the most recent IPCC assessment, efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are critically important. So that's just at a baseline, we know that we need to be addressing our greenhouse gas emissions. What I think many of you may be familiar with, but just worth kind of setting the baseline here, is that, in addition to carbon dioxide, there are other pollutants that contribute to global warming. And really the focus of this conversation on methane is part of this category of short-lived climate pollutants, often also referred to as super pollutants, which includes methane, HFCs, which is a type of refrigerant gas, and black carbon. And the reason that they're called short-lived is because they do not stay in the atmosphere for as long as carbon dioxide. So while they're particularly potent and they have this high global warming potential, efforts to mitigate them can also have a really significant impact in slowing global warming and climate change in the short term. So it's a really key part of California's policies to combat climate change, to address our methane emissions. Because methane is a particularly potent short-lived climate pollutant. And methane emissions are responsible for about 20% of the global warming now driving climate change. So we see a lot of really great opportunity to both have climate benefits, but also have health benefits in reducing our methane emissions. So we can get into this more in some of the discussion, but just want to say that, since 2017, California has had a statewide cross-sectoral whole of government strategy called the Short-Lived Climate Pollutant Reduction Strategy to address these pollutants. And this strategy really features methane quite prominently. And as part of California's work in short-lived climate pollutants, we also have a statutory requirement to reduce our interim target of a 40% reduction in methane emissions by 2030 compared to 2013 levels. So that's kind of the main target that we're going towards now, is this 40% reduction by 2030. Of course, 2030 is right around the corner, and there is a lot of work that we need to do in the meantime to get to those reductions that we need to see. So that includes reducing the amount of organic waste disposed at landfills, developing strategies and programs to reduce methane emissions from manure and from enteric fermentation in livestock, which is often, for those who may not be familiar with enteric fermentation, it's essentially the burps often of cows releases methane into the atmosphere. And then one of the other key areas that we're focused on is plugging orphaned and abandoned oil and gas wells that leak methane and detecting those leaks. So of course, those three things are really only part of the picture, but we know that there are dozens of policy levers that need to be pulled to reduce emissions of many different types of sources of methane across agriculture, energy, solid waste, and wastewater. And I'm really excited to be able to share throughout this hour that we have a bit more about California's efforts with subnational partnerships that we have with our subnational methane action coalition that we're working with the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment at Berkeley. But then also to talk about our work on methane detection and satellite technology and some of the promising work that is going on there for really on a research level, but then how it actually translates to regulation and most importantly, mitigation of really seeing a reduction in methane emissions, because ultimately that is the most important thing that we're driving toward, is getting methane out of the atmosphere and being able to slow the rate of climate change. So I will stop there. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'm happy to invite Xiaopu now, and she has some slides, which you shall shortly see. Xiaopu, are you seeing the screen?
Yes, it's perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Shivani, again for the kind introduction. And following the great remarks by Sarah, I will provide a short overview on China's ongoing efforts to address methane emissions, as well as identify a selected list of opportunities to further raise the country's methane ambition and strengthen their methane mitigation action. So again, my name is Xiaopu Sun. I am currently the Senior China Counsel at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, IGSD. So IGSD is an international environmental organization with the mission to mitigate the short-lived climate pollutants, including methane. Next slide, please. Slide before, if you could. Thank you. So a little bit more further for context setting purposes, China is one of the largest methane emitters according to the official Chinese government data. In 2014, China contributed over 55 megatons of methane emissions. To put this in perspective, the global methane emissions were estimated at a little over 321 megaton in 2015. Of course, there are many more recent data analysis indicating that the methane emissions have been on the rise over the past years, especially. And methane mitigation is, of course, critical for climate mitigation because it is the fastest and best strategy currently available to slow the near-term warming. Additionally, because methane is a precursor to tropospheric ozone, therefore, cutting methane emissions also reduce harm to human health and crop yields. Next slide, please. So in terms of China's recent developments on methane mitigation regulation and policies, most recently, in November 2023, China released a comprehensive methane policy document entitled the National Methane Emissions Control Action Plan. In this plan, China lists a total of 8 prioritized areas for methane mitigation, and I try to group them into 5 categories here. The first one is to strengthen the MRE system of methane emissions. This encompasses activities, for example, to utilize the existing environmental monitoring system to also monitor the atmospheric concentration of methane. China will also require the large methane emitters to periodically report their methane emissions. Satellite monitoring, of course, will play a major role in part of this MRE strengthening effort. Good. Oh, actually, the slide before, please, Shivani. Thank you. So additionally, efforts will be carried out to promote sectoral methane mitigations in the key sectors, including energy, agriculture, and waste. It is also noteworthy that China prioritizes efforts that works towards the synergistic control of methane and other pollutants, for example, the VOCs. Additionally, China will support technical innovation for methane mitigation, as well as intending to improve the regulatory standard and incentive systems that all work toward mitigating methane emissions. Last but not least, China will also promote and participate in the global methane governance and international cooperation, including, for example, through the policies and initiatives under the Belt and Road Initiative and the South-South Climate Change Cooperation platforms. For anyone interested, IGSD's annotated English reference translation of the full Methane Action Plan is available on our website. Next slide, please. Furthermore, the National Action Plan does include a list of quantitative targets. I'm not going to go through this one by one here, but I'd like to share a couple of our observations. First of all of these quantitative targets really highlight the resource reutilization aspect of methane mitigation instead of direct quantitative methane emission reduction targets. Additionally, some of the quantitative targets that are listed here are actually first announced or incorporated into other policy documents that were released prior to the promulgation of this National Action Plan. Therefore, they are not really new additional targets, instead are just reiteration of priorly announced targets. Next slide, please. Of course, the National Action Plan is not the only nor the first methane-related China policy document. In order to acquire a more comprehensive understanding on China's efforts to address methane, I also include a number of relevant policy frameworks in China, including, for example, China's effort to build a circular economy. This mainly encompasses activities, for example, to promote resource reutilization during the processes of production, transportation, and consumption. Of course, China's recent years' climate policy developments have been really embedded and based upon their overarching climate goals, the so-called dual carbon goals, which are the targets to peak its carbon emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. Further, on some sectoral sources of methane, for example, on the energy sector, it is also critical to look into China's broad efforts to promote its energy system transition. For example, China has announced the goal to increase the percentage of non-fossil fuels to around 20% of total energy consumption by 2025, and to further raise the goal to 25% by 2030 and to over 80% by 2060. President Xi also announced that China will strictly control the consumption of coal during the 14th five-year period, which is the current 5-year of 2021 to 2025, and then gradually reduce the consumption during the 15th five-year period with the upcoming 2026 to 2030. Similarly, for the waste sector, for example, China has already in place the system and regulatory framework to control waste pollution through, for example, a system for household waste classification, a separate campaign, and a law and regulation system on anti-food waste. Additionally, also this year, as I mentioned in the earlier slide, China prioritizes measures and efforts that promote the synergistic control of methane and other air pollutants. So this links to China's law and policy efforts really over the past decade also to reduce the air pollution in China. Last but not least, I think also relevant to the conversation today is on the market incentives that could be deployed to promote methane mitigation. For example, by including methane mitigation and reutilization projects in the greenhouse gas voluntary emission trading system in China. Next slide, please. So with that overview, I would also like to share some of the near-term opportunities to get our conversation started today. These opportunities include, for example, to advance China's methane ambition through bilateral and multilateral engagement, particularly in the U.S.-China Sunnyland statement that was released in November 2023. Both countries are committed to incorporate methane action and targets into each country's 2035 national determined contributions. Secondly, there are opportunities to also strengthen China's national mandatory regulations and standards to control the sectoral sources of methane emissions. For example, there is an immediate opportunity to strengthen China's methane emission standard for the coal mining sector. Thirdly, last but definitely not least, is the opportunity to work on methane reduction pilot projects at the subnational level. As Sarah Louise mentioned, California has really been leading on this front, including the engagement with the Chinese provinces and cities, including methane mitigation. One last point I'd like to mention is these three opportunities are really interactive. They are not separate and independently work. For example, in the Sunnyland statement, there is a section specifically looking into U.S.-China subnational collaborations. And through the subnational level methane reduction collaboration and projects, one of the great outcomes could be, for these efforts, pilots, experiences to be eventually incorporated into China's national mandatory regulatory systems. Next slide, please. So that was the overall overview as well as the opportunities. I'd also like to share on the slide a number of additional IGSD resources, including the first published paper is a collaboration with the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law at the National University of Singapore, looking into all the details on China's methane mitigation regulations, policies, and laws, as well as collaboration opportunities. With that, thank you very much for the opportunity speaking with you today, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks so much, Xiaopu, for that extensive overview. And now I'm happy to guide us into the Q&A section and that I will moderate. And then towards the end, we will open the Q&A to the audience. Thanks so much both again. My first question is kind of reflecting back on what happened at COP28. This was one of the first conference of parties where we saw a lot of conversations and action around methane. So how do you think conversations around methane have changed in the past year, kind of past COP28? And either of you can start, maybe Sarah?
Yeah, I can go ahead and kick us off here. I think that one of the major takeaways that we've seen is that key national and subnational actors have begun to take methane more seriously. Simply, it is really risen to a level, getting the attention that it deserves because of its importance in reducing the effects of climate change. So specifically, a couple things to point out of news that came from COP28 in Dubai last year is that there was a methane finance sprint, which was led by the US State Department, that resulted in an announcement of $1 billion in new grants for methane abatement in low and middle income countries. So that was really significant. And then another section around sort of funding is that international financial institutions approved over $3.5 billion for new investments for methane reducing projects. 50 oil and gas companies pledged to achieve near zero methane emissions and stop routine flaring by 2030. And 6 global food giants launched the Dairy Methane Action Alliance to promote transparency across the corporate food industry's supply chain, particularly on methane from manure and enteric fermentation. So those are some of the concrete things that came out of COP28. And then just a few weeks ago, there was the 2024 Global Methane Forum, where dozens of countries are now working with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which is convened by the United Nations Environment Program, to enhance the inclusion of methane in this next round of nationally determined contributions that they submit. So I think that generally there's a lot going on globally in the methane space where it's really getting the attention that it needs. And then, locally, I think this is also where I would highlight that one of the key outcomes on our end in California from COP28 was the official launch of the Subnational Methane Action Coalition, which was announced at Climate Week last year by CalEPA Secretary Yana Garcia, and then officially launched at COP by CARB Chair Randolph and Natural Resources Secretary Wade Crowfoot in Dubai. And so the Subnational Methane Action Coalition is a counterpart to provide local subnational jurisdictions with a venue for taking collective action and increasing their ambition to reduce methane emissions. So it's a counterpart to the Global Methane Pledge, which over 150 countries have pledged to. And so happy to talk more about SMAC perhaps later in this conversation as well, which is the Subnational Methane Action Coalition. But that's something that we're really excited about in California because we see it as such an opportunity to catalyze really concrete projects of like getting pilot projects on the ground, really reducing methane emissions, and then also supporting jurisdictions as they build out their inventories and even getting this baseline understanding of where the methane emissions are in their jurisdiction.
Thanks, Sarah. Do you like to add anything, Xiaopu?
Because I guess to follow up on Sarah's points, I definitely share the view that, methane has attracted a growing attention, both politically and policy at technical and data, all of the levels. I think it's further, the developments around and during COP28 further iterated that, methane is an issue that needs to be addressed at global, national, subnational, at all levels, and through international collaboration, policy regulations, as well as climate finance and technology. In terms of China's methane policy development, again, it shows that, China announced the intent to develop its national methane emissions control action plan in the U.S.-China Glasgow joint declaration in 2021. And the national action plan was eventually released right prior to the COP28. I guess it further guides us as to following COP28 and following China and many other countries hopefully join the group as announcing their national policy documents on methane, what's the next steps, and what are the collaborative opportunities for institutions and stakeholders like us.
Thanks so much, both. I think I will pose one specific question to each of you that's been on top of my mind. So this question is for Xiaopu. Could you expand on China's methane emissions control action plan? I think we saw an overview during the slides, but what can we expect as follow-ups from this plan in operation? And then if you could also touch on IGSD and nonprofits and industry's role in kind of making this plan successful. That would be.
Right. I guess I should address that, it's a community effort in terms of supporting and, advocating for China to promulgate such plan. It does not, any individual institutes really can make this happen. And the U.S.-China bilateral engagement has certainly played, as we can see, played a very important role in that throughout that process. Another thing is on the action plan itself, as I mentioned, it's an intent as a guiding document that lists all the prioritized areas for methane mitigation. It's not intended to serve as the sole and only document, like guiding the next steps, what China gonna take. That works in both ways in terms, there will be opportunities for us work towards raising the ambition and identify the policy gaps and opportunities and incorporate into the regulatory and legal policy frameworks in China. That also underlines, the need to understand other broader, as I mentioned in the other slide, linked to the other existing policy frameworks that China has already been undertaken on those fronts. I also noticed, if I may, there's a question in the audience about the data issue. So even prior to China release the National Action Plan, there have been a lot of conversation and discussion on data accessibility, on data credibility, and how to access them, how to make sure data transparency in many of those fronts. In fact, China Minister Xie Zhenhua, he did indicated in multiple occasions that one of the key reasons that China could not commit to any quantitative methane mitigation targets is because the lack of data understanding in terms of the methane emission sources and quantities from different sectors. So that could be another great area for utilizing the international sourced data, but understanding that China has its own existing monitoring system and also developing their own satellite to monitor methane emissions. Only final point on that, I think there's, following that data question, right? At least there are three aspects that data could play a critical role. First one is in terms of how you can identify the potential non-compliance with the existing regulations that are in place, the super emitters, the hotspotted methane emissions that can only be identified through satellite or other technologies. Secondly is, as I mentioned, identifying policy gaps, especially for countries like China has an overall framework in place, but has yet detailed on all of the implementation plans in terms of not only the National Action Plan, but also in terms of what they're going to commit in the future. So that's my third point, with all of the additional data and developments. What are the indications for China's methane action and the targets, including targets and action to be included in its 15th five-year plan, as well as the 2035 NDCs. So I'll stop here.
Thanks, Xiaopu. Actually, Sarah, we can work off of that, and maybe you can talk a little bit about how these new data streams from all of the new satellites is being incorporated into the regulatory process in California. I know California is kind of at the forefront of the satellite data as of now. Very excited to hear about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share about the work that's going on in California in this. So really, generally, it's a very exciting time for the use of new monitoring technologies and platforms related to methane. So there's, recent and upcoming launches of satellites mean that there will be several technologies to monitor methane from space. And each technology has different capabilities, including differences in spatial coverage and the frequency that it measures, and also at like the level or the concentration at which they can detect methane from space. When all these technologies kind of can be brought together, you can really see much more information on when, where, and how much methane is being emitted from various sources. So this information we see as being able to inform inventories of methane emissions, either directly or indirectly through modeling. And then also, really importantly, to answer the question specifically on this integration of regulation, is that some data streams can be integrated into regulations for additional and quicker mitigation of methane. So CARB, the California Air Resources Board, has done this recently with its recently approved amendments to our oil and gas methane regulation that we have in the state, where in that oil and gas methane regulation, operators must take action if they are informed of a methane plume that has been identified via satellite-based remote sensing. So it's, I think, a concrete example of where California is leading and having sure that there's this linkage between the data and the regulation to actually get to the methane mitigation that we want to see. And we're also, the agency CARB is also considering similar amendments to our landfill methane regulation through the public process that's ongoing. I think I would just maybe use this opportunity to also talk about like some of the challenges that we're seeing with measurements and detection from satellite, which is that, even with this amazing increase in technology, the satellite measurements are still snapshots in time, and they aren't able to measure everywhere. So there are still some limitations into what we can extrapolate out from those snapshots for getting a sense of where all methane emissions are occurring at any given time. So I think there's a lot of need to ensure that we have quality assurance practices in place and things to be able to like ensure that the data that we're looking at is as high quality as possible and reflective of what's actually happening on the ground. So, I mean, I think I just talked about this, but it's just worth repeating that really the use of data from plume to be able to effectively use the data from plume mappers to achieve mitigation, you really do need regulation and knowledge of the infrastructure and the ownership of that infrastructure, which is a key sort of layer of information that regulators need to be able to build up. And that's often overlooked, but really the lessons learned from the Air Resources Board is that information is critical to be able to say that they know on the ground who is responsible for the facilities that the methane emissions are coming from. And so, as we are working with subnational partners and others around the world, and California is very eager to be able to share that expertise and to be able to share our lessons learned so that other jurisdictions, as they're developing their regulations and identifying what they need to ensure that they're properly, making that match of the detection to regulation, that we can provide them with information that can make that as seamless as possible, we hope. So, I mean, I'll just maybe close on this just to say that it's really exciting. We really do think that there's this, allows for this step change really in our understanding of methane emissions, and it provides a lot of new policy and mitigation opportunities. And that we are looking forward to continuing to invest in satellites that can measure methane, but also want to continue our efforts on other ground-based observational technologies to complement that satellite technology as well. So just kind of continuing a multi-pronged approach to ensuring that we're detecting leaks and then mitigating them.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I think I want to touch just a little bit on this cross-sectoral approach that is required for methane mitigation. And maybe you can shortly, either of you can shortly describe how you see methane interacting with other environmental policies. We have a question in the chat that we can get to, but how does it interact, for example, with environmental justice aspects and public health aspects? So maybe a brief analysis of that. And either of you can go first.
I can quickly jump in here. Again, I think we touched on that a bit earlier in my presentation in terms of, to understand the policy framework that involves in methane mitigation is linking to other existing priorities that, again, works in both ways. For example, China has committed to quantitative methane-related targets, mainly for the resource reutilization aspect. So that promotes methane mitigation in a way. In other aspect is understanding how methane mitigation can further contribute those to those co-benefits. I believe the the UNEP and CCAC global methane assessment has already looked into some of those aspects in terms of every million of methane mitigated can contribute how much to public health and other co-benefits aspect. Those are surely critical for many countries, including a lot of global South developing countries' perspectives to promote their interest. On the other end, is this also shows the urgency or the need that we need to convey to government or non-government stakeholders the urgency of climate mitigation through including reducing methane mitigation in the near term, and how that's critical for slowing down the near-term warming. So that, there's the policy reaction as to commit to direct methane reduction targets. There's certainly a lot more work to do, I think, in that aspect, including understanding and conveying that, climate damage could also be very costly economically, aside from co-benefits perspective.
Yeah, I would echo those points that Xiaopu made as well around really that intersection of health and the public health benefits. I think that just to take a step back, I think all of our climate work really is linked with our efforts on environmental justice because we know that communities that are disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change are those environmental justice communities as well, and communities that have historically been underinvested in and who currently, suffer worse air quality and other environmental impacts. And so I think everything that we do as a state really has environmental justice as a through line in its work, and that is a top priority of Secretary Garcia at the California Environmental Protection Agency, and also of Governor Newsom for the state as a whole. And so I think really specifically, as we've touched on, right, methane emissions, drawing those down helps to solve helps to solve climate change, but it also can improve air quality and improve health outcomes for residents. So that's a key through line. And then I would say maybe taking, slightly different tack also on sort of the cross-sectoral policies on methane. So, I think I said at the beginning, but just to emphasize, like in California, right, it's the priority areas are dairy and livestock industry, landfills, and oil and gas systems. And as we're working on all of these, there's definitely a whole of government approach to addressing emissions from all of these sectors. So we work really closely, for example, with our California Department of Food and Ag in the dairy and livestock space. And I would say that maybe the other aspect to discuss on here too, that was touched on as well by Xiaopu, is this measurement, reporting, and verification of methane being kind of also a through line across all sectors. And that's something that really we're really glad to see that there is a focus on that MRV and inventory development within China's National Methane Action Plan, because that is a really core component of methane policy to ensure that regulations are working as they're intended and that they're enabling compliance and enforcement of mitigation policies. So we're maybe this is a good opportunity just to talk a little bit more about California's partnership with Chinese subnational governments, which where we're really excited that there's so much opportunity to collaborate between California and China on climate change generally and on methane specifically within those frameworks of cooperation that we have, our memorandums of understanding. So just by way of brief background for those who might not be as familiar with this, but Governor Newsom went to China last year in the fall, and while he was there, was able to sign several agreements with Chinese provincial governments and with national government entities to further our cooperation with China on climate change. And actually, Secretary Garcia and Secretary Omashakin of the California State Transportation Agency just led a delegation to China in March as a follow-on to the governor's visit. And in that visit, we were able to go to Shanghai, where there's a lot of work on methane mitigation in the rice cultivation sector. And then also we were able to speak with folks from Guangdong province, which is really leading on methane emissions, including from the landfill like waste sector. So there's a lot of promise for the collaboration that California has with China. And we're really looking forward to continuing that work as we really strive to reduce methane emissions across all of the sectors.
Thanks so much, both. That was pretty comprehensive. And I suppose one last question on my end, and we'll open it up to the audience, is what are your outlook looking forward to COP29? What do you think can be achieved in this time frame we have? I know a year is kind of a quick turnaround, but anything that we look forward to will help us shape decisions. And maybe we can maintain the order of Xiaopu and Sarah and then open it up.
Certainly. I think there are already a great list of opportunities and achievements that are, for example, incorporated in the U.S.-China Sunny Land Statement on the subnational cooperation, on follow through on information sharing, knowledge sharing, and capacity building for the implementation of the National Action Plan over the past years, especially with the influx of methane data. Hopefully, we'll be able to strengthen the MRE system and to be able to further identify the policy gaps to mitigate methane. I think there's also a great opportunity, including through COP29 and other multilateral venues, to have the voice of the other global South country being heard in terms of not only working with the developed countries, but also for China as a growing power, as a developing country, working through their own international collaborative initiatives. As I mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative, and China has been promoting green development, green investment under that platform, as well as the specific climate collaboration, South-South climate change cooperation. Definitely worth exploring on how methane mitigation can be highlighted as one of the prioritized collaboration areas under those platforms. With that, yeah, I think those, I know there's also the other part of the question about what's the challenging part. I guess it's more of, in my thinking, as something need a longer term of engagement, and because involves more of a analysis and modeling work. So that's mainly in terms, what countries, especially China, going to commit for the next 5 year, the 15th 5-year of 2026 to 2030. What are the methane mitigation action and ambitions that could be incorporated and implemented throughout the 5-year period, as well as eventually reflected in its 2035 NDCs.
And I can jump in here too with my thoughts on that question. So I think as we are looking ahead to COP29, really hoping to be able to see that continued energy that we saw come out of COP28 on methane, be a through line into COP29. One thing to note is this next COP is going to be in Azerbaijan, which recently joined the Global Methane Pledge. So we are kind of, I would say, hopefully awaiting methane-related announcements about what will be on the COP29 agenda. And then also this upcoming COP has been sort of touted as a finance COP. So hoping to see some other major next steps following the methane finance sprint that I mentioned that happened at COP28, and also the financial institution investments that were already announced. And then to also take a step forward for COP30, the next round of the nationally determined contributions that countries will be bringing to COP30, they'll be updated at that COP. And so that's just something that we're keeping an eye on too, is like as part of the work that I mentioned before of where countries are working to incorporate methane more into their overall thinking on what their contributions are for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I expect that we'll continue to see methane be at the table. I would say some challenges that we have identified include just a lack of baselining, of like those lack of inventories of knowing where we're starting from, and that this is something that's come up in the context of our subnational methane action coalition, is that there's a need to develop methane inventories that are not just based on modeling estimates, but that are based on what's actually happening on the ground in various jurisdictions. And then I think this also maybe gets to one of the questions that I'd be happy to talk about more from the chat as well around the dairy sector, but just knowing that the abatement of emissions from enteric fermentation, I would say, is a key challenge, both in California and in other jurisdictions. So I will say maybe in closing on this question that I'm really hopeful that as we look to COP29, that we will have more members join our subnational methane action coalition. Right now we have 17 jurisdictions, including California, and we are in a recruitment push to get more participants to join. And so that's for governments. So that is for states and provinces around the world to be able to join us in that effort. So if any of you are connected to any governments abroad who might be interested in taking action on methane, please do not hesitate to send them California's way. We would be happy to figure out how to best engage them in this work. So there's a lot of work to be done on methane, but we're very eager and excited to keep up the momentum.
Thanks so much, Xiaopu and Sarah. I see that we have pretty much answered most questions from the audience as of now. But if you see any of the questions that you would like to address, feel free to. The one question that I think could close out this conversation well is, will we see a binding global methane agreement? We have this pledge in place, and we have all of these collaborations that are ongoing around it, including the exciting SMAC initiative. Do you envision a binding agreement in the near future as well?
I can start off on that one. I'd like to break that question down to two parts. As for one part, do I believe in global binding methane agreement is essential for methane mitigation and action? I think the answer is positive. As I mentioned earlier, we have seen in the past how bilateral and multilateral engagement and collaboration has been instrumental in not only addressing methane, but also other climate mitigation. Particularly part of my other work focus is on the phase down of hydrofluorocarbon, which has been carried out through the Montreal Protocol and continuing evolving and have been really effective to save that part of climate trouble. So I think, yes, there is at least a need to having that open conversation and invite parties and countries that are interested in this topic, because a binding agreement not only means responsibilities, also means the opening resources and technical assistance, capacity building for countries in need, and having that environmental justice aspect of, as we call it, common but differentiated responsibilities among developing and developed countries. In all of these aspects, it offers a great value to push forward. On the other aspect, I ask myself that question perhaps every day do I have a vision on how we're gonna get there? I think it's we have to work through a process of, do we have take a similar UNFCCC framework convention approach, or should we start with sectoral commitments and agreements at global level? I think we've been seeing some of the very initial, maybe some of the industry-led initiatives working towards that, but certainly not yet a global binding level. And I'm more than happy to discuss with our audience who's interested in this topic in further details.
And I'll just add maybe to add some color on the Subnational Methane Action Coalition too, that for folks that are joining that, while it's not a binding, like legally binding agreement, that folks the jurisdictions that are signing up there are committing to setting methane emissions reduction goals and to be working on creating a methane action plan. So we're definitely still at the stage of really supporting subnational jurisdictions to create inventories, set the goal, set the plan, do the work. I think making sure that effort is also happening at the subnational level too, that can inform additional national action on methane and globally.
With that, I think thanks so much, Sarah and Xiaopu, for joining in this conversation. And I have high hope as a methane policy fellow. I have high hopes that there'll be tons of action around this critical climate policy. And thanks, Louise, for introducing us. Thank you to CLEE for this opportunity. And we will carry on this conversation in our future sessions. Thanks so much. And our CLEE's work on methane is linked in the chat for all of you to check, and we remain open to your questions, concerns, and information. Thanks so much.